How's it, everybody? Jeremy here from J Life SA. Wanted to take a moment to talk you through some of our existing definitions as a disciple making movement. I think it's very important that we have definitions, and the reason for that is because they help us give expression to what we have in our hearts and what we have in our vision. Because we are a movement, definitions tend to change over time as we constantly look at ways of improving what we believe Jesus has called us to. But at this particular time, I think it's very important that we just spell out exactly what it is that we stand for, and that we give those terms some weight by unpacking them, and also so that we're all kind of speaking the same language. So I thought it would be cool to just share some of these thoughts with you. So I want to talk about a couple of definitions. The first three definitions deal with our present approach to building a movement of disciple making. First three speak to our approach, and then the other definitions define the role players. So let's speak about the approach first. So in 2015, the J-Life Africa leaders came together from around the continent and began to think through and pray through an approach to build a disciple-making movement across the continent and then through the various countries or the various nations where J-Life serves. And this is the approach that they landed on. Cast wide, narrow down, and go deep. This doesn't take anything away from our mission. It doesn't take anything away from our vision, but it gives a bit of an approach or a bit of a strategy to how we do what it is that we want to do. So what do we mean by casting wide? When we talk about cast wide, we're essentially talking about an event. It's a big group promotional event. It's led by an MBX. I'll talk about what an MBX is in a moment. And the event basically introduces prospective leaders, and that's key leaders, to Christ's life as a model for disciple making, and also to our GC Square philosophy. It gives leaders an opportunity to learn about the importance of disciple making, and it gives them the opportunity to sign up to join a GC Square group. The event could take an hour, it could take a few hours, could take a whole day, but it's essentially an event where a large group of key leaders are invited to get some promotional work done. That's cast wide. Second term, which is also part of this threefold approach of casting wide, narrowing down, and going deep. Second term is narrow down. What do we mean by narrow down? Narrow down is essentially, I define it like this. It's the work of an MBX or a team of MBXs, a group of MBXs, where they do training and coaching in a GC Square group. So it's our traditional GC Square groups, a group of about 8 to 12 key leaders, where these key leaders are being coached and discipled to go back to their local leadership teams, and implement what they've learned in that GC Square group amongst their local leadership teams, amongst their local churches, their local ministry teams. That's narrowing down. It's essentially GC Square groups. But thirdly, go deep. So we talk about cast wide, narrow down, and go deep. This is something that in 2015 the guys felt very strongly about, and they felt that the Lord was challenging us to move from simply training to discipling. I think it's one thing us, talking about disciple making and celebrating disciple making and encouraging the leaders we train to make disciples. It's a whole nother thing where we actually begin to disciple leaders. And we understand that we can't disciple the crowds. But Jesus invested in a few for the sake of the crowds. We see this clearly in Matthew chapter 5, with Matthew's account of the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus calls the disciples to himself and sits down, begins to open his mouth and teach them in the hearing of the crowd. So it's investing in the few for the sake of the many. And this is what we mean by going deep. It's actually discipling maybe 2, maybe just 3 people who've come out of that GC Square group. It's discipling them to go back and make disciples. So it's not just coaching. It's not just general helping you implement the training in your ministry, but it's actually building a relationship and discipling them. And from amongst those people, we trust that God may even raise future MBXs. But the point is that we go deep and we disciple the few. I said to you, the first three definitions deal with our approach: cast wide, narrow down, and go deep. So let's talk about a few more definitions, but these definitions refer to our roles as people who are building a movement of disciple making. First definition, MB, or movement builder. What is a movement builder? A movement builder is a leader who's been trained in a GC Square group and who is now building a movement of disciple making in their local churches. So somebody comes to a GC Square group, you walk them through the GC Square training, they then go back and they begin to train their teams to make disciples who make disciples. That's what we call a movement builder. And essentially that movement builder is someone who is also being trained, yes, coached, yes, but also discipled by the person who led that GC Square group. Now, not everybody who comes to a GC Square group is going to go back and implement. Some of them may, some of them may not. But then also, not everybody who goes back and implements is necessarily someone that we'll disciple. We can't disciple everyone. But essentially, we want to come alongside a few movement builders. As I said when I explained Go Deep, we want to come alongside a few movement builders and really disciple them. But a movement builder is a leader who's been part of a GC Square group and who's gone back to build that disciple-making movement in their churches by not just training them in the material, but also discipling them to make disciples. What is a movement builder multiplier, or an MBX? So still talking about roles here. A movement builder multiplier is a leader who's casting wide, who's narrowing down, and who's going deep. See how we're bringing it together. It's a leader who's casting wide, so they're able to recruit groups of key leaders, potential attendees of GC Square groups, potential GC Square group members. But they're able to recruit these people and cast wide, lead those cast wide promotional sessions. But they're also able to narrow down and host GC Square groups and walk through the GC Square training, the 4 modules. But in addition to that, an MBX, or movement builder multiplier, is somebody who's multiplying movement builders. So where you have a movement builder who's been in a GC Square group and they've gone back and they're beginning to train their own leaders and their own leadership teams, a movement builder multiplier is someone who's able to reproduce more movement builders. In other words, they going deep with movement builders, they discipling those movement builders. So not just guys that are going back and passionate about disciple making and helping build the movement locally, but guys who can work trans-locally. They're able to reproduce guys that can make disciples of leaders. So a movement builder multiplier is someone who disciples leaders, and it's someone who disciples leaders beyond just one local church context. And that's many of you. You guys are making disciples of leaders, and you're not just training them, but you're beginning to come alongside them and ultimately go deep with them. Okay, there's one last one that we've begun talking about now on Africa leadership level. Guys are beginning to talk about this transitional phase between a movement builder and a movement builder multiplier. And so for lack of a better term at the moment, we kind of just calling it a movement builder multiplier in training, an MBX in training. What do we mean by an MBX in training? It's a leader who's casting wide, so they're recruiting people and like recruiting key leaders, and they're introducing them to the life of Christ as a model for disciple making. They're also beginning to narrow down. In other words, they're starting GC Square groups and they're rolling out the GC Square training, but they have not yet begun to disciple other key leaders. We're saying a movement builder multiplier, an MBX, is someone who casts wide, narrows down, and goes deep. In other words, they are a leader who's discipling leaders of other churches, other ministries, just across the kingdom. But a movement builder, multiplier in training is someone who's not going deep yet. They're not discipling other leaders yet. They're doing training, and they're able to even pull in new leaders for training. But until they go beyond training, we're saying that's not quite what we mean by an MBX. So again, it's part of the shift away from just doing training to actually discipling people. And again, we're not saying we're going to be discipling all the people who come to our groups. That's not realistic. Some of you are already discipling people in your own ministry. Some of you are already discipling people in your own ministry context. But as you begin to work beyond your own ministry context, you can't disciple all the people you train, but you can disciple a few. You can disciple 1, 2, maybe 3. And that's what we're saying. MBX. So that's it. Cast wide, narrow down, go deep. Movement builder multiplier. And then this transitional movement builder multiplier in training. Okay, I hope this little video and these definitions help. God bless you. Thank you so much for all the work you do to mobilize a movement of disciple making around the country. And Lord, we just pray that you will increase your kingdom movement. And I pray, Lord, that the kingdom agenda will remain heavy on our hearts, and that by the power of your Spirit, we will obey the kingdom agenda. In Jesus' name, bless each one of these precious people who are building this movement around the country. In Jesus' name, amen. Thanks, guys.